Shane van Gisbergen was not exposed by a rival team. He was not exposed by NASCAR officials. He was exposed by the people inside his own garage, the engineers, the crew members, the data analysts who watched Reddick dominate at COTA and then had to answer questions about why SVG's car told a completely different story. Shane van Gisbergen was not taken down by a rival. He was not caught by NASCAR officials. He was exposed by his own garage, and that is the part that changes everything about how you read this story. COTA was supposed to be a showcase moment for 23XI racing as a two-car operation. Tyler Reddick was dominant. The car was fast, the tire wear was clean, and by the time the checkered flag dropped, the performance gap between Reddick and the rest of the field was impossible to ignore. That should have been a pure organizational win, two cars on track, one of them proving that 23XI racing belongs in the championship conversation. Instead, the story coming out of COTA was about Shane van Gisbergen, specifically about what SVG had been saying to team members about Reddick's car. The accusation was pointed and specific, that Reddick's car had an invisible aerodynamic advantage and unusually low tire wear, and for about 24 hours that accusation had enough oxygen around it to become a real story. Then SVG's own team started talking, not publicly, not in press conferences. In the way information always travels in a NASCAR garage, through conversations between engineers, through paddock talk that finds its way to the right ears. Through the kind of quiet corrections that happen when people who actually know the data decide they are not going to let a false narrative take root. And what those people said, the people inside SVG's own organization who had access to the same numbers he was looking at, did not support what SVG had been suggesting. You could feel the shift the moment it started. Because in a NASCAR garage, when a driver makes a technical accusation about a teammate, and the response from inside his own team is silence followed by correction rather than support, that driver has a problem that goes way beyond one race weekend. SVG did not just fail to get his accusation validated. He got contradicted by the people who were supposed to be in his corner. That is brutal. That is the kind of moment that defines how a driver is perceived inside an organization for the rest of a season. And it happened at COTA in front of everyone who was paying attention. Here is the thing about how NASCAR garages process these situations. The technical staff at a team like 23XI Racing are not going to publicly throw a driver under the bus. That is not how it works. But there are ways of not supporting a narrative that are just as loud as a direct contradiction. When engineers who have access to both cars' data do not back up what their own driver is saying, the garage notices. When crew members who were present for the conversations that SVG had start quietly clarifying what was actually said versus what got reported, the garage notices that too. And the garage noticed at COTA, Reddick's performance that day was not mysterious. It was the result of a setup that his team had been developing specifically for COTA's unique demands. The low-speed corners, the technical sections, the tire management requirements that make that track unlike almost anything else on the NASCAR calendar. The tire wear numbers that SVG reportedly flagged were not evidence of an illegal advantage. They were evidence of a better setup. And the people inside 23XI Racing who built that setup knew the difference immediately. The accusation SVG made required his own team to either validate it or distance themselves from it. They distanced themselves from it. And in doing so, they exposed something about SVG that the COTA result alone never would have, that a world champion who cannot explain a performance gap through his own preparation is capable of looking for that explanation in the wrong places. Now before we get into what this revealed about the internal power structure at 23XI Racing and why the team's response to SVG's accusation matters more than the accusation itself. If you are a NASCAR fan who wants the real story behind what happens in these garages, hit that like button, drop a comment right now telling me whether you think SVG genuinely believed what he was saying or whether this was something else entirely. And subscribe if you are not already here, because the second part of this story is where it gets genuinely uncomfortable for SVG's future at this team. Because what his own team members said after COTA did not just fail to support him. It changed how everyone inside that garage sees him, and that shift does not reverse itself. The performance gap at COTA between Reddick and SVG was not small. That is the starting point for understanding everything that happened after the race. Reddick was running at a level that put him in a completely different conversation from his teammate, cleaner through the technical sections, more consistent on tire management, visibly more comfortable with the car in the conditions COTA demands. For a casual fan watching the broadcast, that gap looks like one driver having a great day. For an engineer inside the garage looking at the data, that gap tells a much more specific story, and SVG was looking at that data. Here is what makes his position at COTA so complicated. Van Gisbergen is not a driver who accepts performance gaps passively. His entire career has been built on relentless technical engagement, understanding why the car does what it does, pushing his engineering staff to find every tenth, refusing to accept that a competitor is simply faster without finding a mechanical explanation for why. That is what made him a world champion. That is the mentality that wins championships at the highest level of motorsport. But that same mentality, applied to a teammate's data in a series he is still learning, produced something that backfired completely. Because the explanation SVG landed on, invisible aerodynamic advantage, unusually low tire wear, required his own team to validate data that they had built and understood from both sides. The engineers at 23XI Racing know what both cars are doing. They know what the setups look like. They know what the tire wear numbers mean in the context of the specific choices each driver and crew chief made for that race weekend. And when SVG's suggested explanation did not match what those engineers were seeing in their own systems, the internal response was not support. It was distance. That distance is what exposed him, but here is what nobody is talking about yet. The real story at COTA was not the accusation. The real story was what the accusation revealed about SVG's standing inside 23XI Racing at this point in the season. Because a driver with full organizational trust does not get quietly contradicted by his own team members after making a technical claim. A driver with full organizational trust gets his concerns investigated privately, handled internally, and never reaches the point where paddock corrections are happening without his knowledge. The fact that it played out the way it did at COTA tells you something important about where SVG sits in the 23XI Racing hierarchy right now. He is not the driver this organization was built around. He is not the driver whose championship run is the team's primary focus. He is the exciting addition, the world champion brought in to add firepower, but the organizational gravity at 23XI Racing pulls toward Reddick. It has from the beginning. And when SVG's accusation put the team in a position where they had to choose between supporting their new driver or protecting the integrity of their established driver's win, the choice was not difficult. They chose Reddick. Quietly, technically, without making it a public statement. But they chose him. And SVG now has to figure out how to operate inside a team that just demonstrated very clearly where its priorities lie when the pressure is on. That is not an easy environment for a world champion who is used to being the center of an organization's universe. Every setup meeting from here carries that subtext. Every data-sharing conversation has that dynamic underneath it. Every race where the performance gap shows up again will bring COTA back into the room, whether anyone says it out loud or not. The tire wear numbers that SVG flagged have now been seen by everyone who matters inside that garage. The engineers have their own read on what those numbers mean. The crew chiefs on both sides of the 23XI racing operation know exactly what happened at COTA from a technical standpoint. And the consensus inside that garage is not what SVG was suggesting. That consensus is what exposed him, not NASCAR, not Reddick, his own team. Here is the question that 23XI Racing has not answered publicly and probably will not answer publicly for as long as they can avoid it. Can Shane van Gisbergen recover his standing inside this organization after what happened at COTA? Because this is not a situation that gets resolved by a strong finish at the next race. Points and results fix a lot of problems in NASCAR. They do not fix the specific problem SVG created at COTA, which is that he made a technical accusation about a teammate that his own team's data did not support, and the people closest to that data made sure the right people knew it. That kind of moment follows a driver, not in press conferences, not in public statements, in the small decisions that organizations make every week that add up to either support or isolation over the course of a long season. Which driver's feedback gets prioritized when the setups need to be finalized for a track like Bristol or Darlington? Which driver's concerns get escalated to ownership level when something needs to change? Which driver the team's best engineers are most motivated to go the extra mile for on a Saturday night when the setup is not quite right and somebody has to stay late to fix it? Those decisions are being shaped right now by what happened at COTA. And they are being shaped in a direction that does not favor SVG. Reddick, meanwhile, is operating with a confidence level that is almost uncomfortable to watch from a competitive standpoint. His son asked him before Daytona if he was finally going to win that race. He won. He came to COTA and delivered a performance that his own teammate could not explain through normal competitive reasoning. The momentum around Reddick inside 23XI Racing right now is the kind that organizations build entire championship campaigns around. And every clean result he adds to that run makes SVG's position more difficult by comparison. Think about what the rest of this season looks like if that gap does not close, because SVG is still learning tracks that Reddick has years of experience on. The intermediate tracks, the short tracks, the superspeedways, every single one of them represents a week where Reddick's institutional knowledge is an advantage that SVG cannot overcome purely through talent. And every week where that advantage shows up in the results is another data point that reinforces the organizational hierarchy that COTA already revealed. That is the structural reality that SVG walked into when he joined 23XI Racing. It was always going to take time to close that gap. But the way COTA played out, the accusation, the team's response, the exposure, that has made the time he needs longer and the environment he needs to close that gap more complicated. Michael Jordan did not build 23XI Racing to watch internal drama derail a championship season. Denny Hamlin did not put this organization together to spend the summer managing tension between two drivers who should be pulling resources in the same direction. The ownership of this team is watching what happened at COTA very carefully. And the message that ownership sends to both drivers about how this situation gets handled going forward will define the entire second half of this season. The uncomfortable question that nobody at 23XI Racing wants to face right now is this: if the performance gap between Reddick and SVG does not close by the halfway point of this season, does this team start making decisions that effectively turn 23XI Racing back into a one-driver championship operation with a very expensive second car? Because that question is already being asked inside that garage, quietly, by people who have access to both the data and the organizational conversations that never reach the public. Was COTA the moment 23XI Racing quietly chose its championship driver, or does SVG still have time to change that answer? Drop it in the comments, because that question is splitting this fanbase right down the middle, and I want to know exactly where you stand. If this is the kind of NASCAR coverage that actually gets into what matters inside these organizations, hit like, leave a comment, and subscribe, because this story has a long way left to run, and every chapter of it is going to be covered right here.